I was born in 1930, and my name is Joe Larkin. Joseph V. Larkin is my complete name. And I was born in Philadelphia on the Eastern Coast. And we moved to San Diego during my career, which I can talk about a little bit later if you'd like me to. And we retired in San Diego after 25 years in the Marine Corps. And we love San Diego, and we love the climate, and we do read the news about the fantastic snows that they have back east, and we know that we're not included in that.
Right, I know. So, can you tell me briefly about your family background? So, you grew up or you were born and raised in the East
I was
Coast?
born and raised in Philadelphia, and my family came from well, we go back in history to the 1800s. Our family immigrated from Ireland. They had what was called the potato famine back in the 1840s, and the people were living off potatoes, but the potatoes became rotten and bad, and they were not edible. And it was the situation was a starving situation for most people. So the immigration, a large immigration, began of the Irish immigrating to the United States. And my great grandfather immigrated in 1840, and he immigrated to the coal mine areas of Pennsylvania. And I guess he was a miner in uh, Ireland. I don't know too much about that, but he became a miner in Pennsylvania. And my father was born in I'll think of the name of the town a little bit, in Pennsylvania, and they immigrated from Pennsylvania down to from the town in Pennsylvania, the mining town, down to Philadelphia, in about 1880. My mother was born in 1889, and my dad was born in 1888. I'll talk about him in a minute, but I'll stay with my mother's family. Uh, the mother's family she had four sisters and two brothers, and they moved to Pennsylvania, like I say, about 1910. And my mom was about 20 years old. I think she was 26 when she married. And they were living in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia at that time. And my dad was a steel worker. And my dad was born in 1888. So they're kind of close in the years. And he was born in Philadelphia, in a place called Frankfurt, a section of Philadelphia. I don't know too much about his family. They came from upstate New York, and from what I understand, they were steel workers also. But they immigrated to Philadelphia and continued to work in the steel industry. My dad worked at a place called Midvale Steel, and he was what they called back then an open hearth worker. This is where the steel company would dump the steel into a large vat, and they would boil it, and when it became molten, then they would dip it out and put it into trays of steel that they were making for whatever industry they were doing. My dad worked there for a long time, until close to World War II. We had seven children in our family, five boys and two girls. And we lived in a row house in Philadelphia, which was about the norm back in the 1920s. My parents bought their home, I think, in 1915. They were married in 1914, a year before, and their first child came along in 1916. And then there was a child every other year for a while, and then there was a stoppage in 1925 until I came along in 1930. I believe I was surprised at my mother. She wasn't too sure what was happening there. But we all, as I said, we lived in a row house. And this was on a street in Philadelphia in a residential district. It was known as Germantown, although the name is a misnomer because it was full of ethnic Irish, Scot, English, Italian, and some Germans. Where the name Germantown, I've never been able to find out it came from. Uh, the house we lived in, it had three bedrooms on the top floor. My mom and dad had one bedroom. My two sisters had the others. And my four brothers had the big bedroom in the back of the house. Now, until I was 5, I lived with my parents in their bedroom. But as I attained the age of 5, I worked my way back to my brother's, the cave, they called it, and I slept in the room with my four brothers. This went on until World War II. My dad continued to work at the plant although they was laid off at times during the 1930s. This was during a bad time in America. And in 1941, the war started with Germany and Japan, and it was quite prosperous in the United States at that time as far as jobs were concerned. My four brothers went into service. Well, three of them went in. One was deferred at that time because he was on a very important job in making batteries for torpedoes, and he worked for a company called Exide Batteries. I didn't know this at the time, but this was a very important thing because, as I found out in later history, the American submarines that were patrolling the Pacific, whenever they would launch a torpedo in this early beginning of the war, the torpedo had a tendency to turn around and come back on them again. It was very inaccurate. So this thing that he did was very important in getting what they called a homing system onto the torpedoes. So he never actually went into the service. My other three brothers did. So he stayed out and was married. Of course, he was deferred because he was married during the war. My other three brothers went into the service, one into the Air Force, two went into the Air Force, and one went into the ground services. Various times during the early 1940s, I was, of course, a teenager at that time, and I remember them coming home on leave and enjoying their time with my parents. Tragedy struck our family. In June of 1944, my brother was in the invasion force of Europe, and he landed on the beaches of Normandy on what they called D-Day. And he was wounded in the legs, not horribly, but enough that he was evacuated to England. He recovered and was sent back into combat, and he was killed 3 months later. This was a tragedy for us because this young man was the center of our family and the love of my mother's life. It was very tragic for her. She tried to handle it but didn't do very well with it, and she died about a year later with heartbreak, really, in 1945. During the war, these were as I said, my young years as a teenager, and I spent these working for certain drives in Philadelphia, scrap drives and paper drives, things that we did for the war effort. After the war, I continued my schooling, and in fact, during the war, I remember a cartoon that was in the newspaper every week of a Marine, and I didn't really know much about Marines, and I just knew that he was a soldier that did something in China, and that piqued my imagination. I liked that, and I followed that character until it was used no longer. And I remembered that, so I went looking for something to do after my school, and my dad suggested I look into some of the services because at that time we didn't have the money for me to continue into college. So he agreed that if I finished school, he would sign for me at 17 to go into the services, and I picked the Marine Corps. So this was 1948. I finished school and went into the Marine Corps as a young man and received my recruit training at Parris Island, South Carolina. This was a 3-month tour, and when I finished that, I was sent up to Camp Lejeune and another base nearby called Cherry Point, which were Marine bases on the east coast of the United States. While I was there in 1950, my 3-year enlistment was just about up. But in June of 1950, the war in Korea started. And of course, that's what most Marines joined, to go to war, to fight. And that didn't happen because I only had 6 months left to do on my enlistment. And I was kind of at wit's end. What was I going to do? I joined the Marine Corps to go to do things for my country. Here I was not allowed to do that. So I missed the first fighting in Korea in the early part of the end of 1950. In 1951, I was allowed to re-enlist, and I was on the next ship to Korea. At that time, we went by boat. We didn't have the aircraft that they have today. Some of our higher-ranking people that needed to be there went by plane, but the planes were not very big back then, and they had to take different hops to get across the Pacific. So we boarded a ship in San Diego Harbor, and it took about 18 days to reach Japan, where we left most of our equipment and our personal belongings, and we went aboard a Japanese LST, they called it then a landing ship tank, and it took us into the coast of Korea. and this was the early part of 1951. And I was on what they called a draft. And the draft was a replacement draft that we used to replace the men that were coming out of Korea. The men were required to do 13 months. And if they survived that, they were evacuated out of Korea. In the meantime, if something happened to them, wounded or killed, of course their bodies were sent home and the wounded were evacuated to Japan. But the attrition was quite high, so the replacement drafts were needed each month. So from the Marine Corps, they have 2,000 to 3,000 men every month going into Korea to replace those that came home. And this replacement draft landed at a place called, if I remember it correctly, Sokori, in the southeast corner of North Korea. It was above the parallel. Now, this was after the evacuation, I can call it, from the Haguru-ri and Koto-ri in North Korea. The Marines came out of there and came down into South Korea, and they fought against guerrilla warfare, the remnants of the North Korean army. And they began to move back up into the southeast corner of North Korea. This is where I joined my battalion. And the battalion was situated near an area called the Punch Bowl, simply because it was a large bowl in the earth surrounded by mountains. My unit was tasked with reinforcing the regiments that were on line against the Chinese. This phase of the war was the beginning of what we called trench warfare, very similar to what the Allied forces experienced in Europe during World War I. Back then, the Germans had advanced toward Paris, and the Allied forces had stopped them near Paris, and both sides retreated to trench warfare, where they angled and fought for pieces of land. And this is what was happening in North and Southeast North Korea. Trench warfare began, and it extended across the whole width of Korea. I would like to go back here a little bit and describe my feelings about Korea. Korea had a couple of different names. It was known as the Hermit Kingdom for a very good reason. They didn't want anybody to fool around with them. And they were also named as the Poland of Asia. Now that could have been a misnomer, but Poland in Europe, Germany or Europe, which were on their borders, was always taking parts of their nation. And that was the same way with Korea. The Chinese were on one side, Japanese on the other, and north of them were the Russians. Somebody always wanted some part of Korea. And it was they fought tenaciously to keep these people out. But the Japanese edged in the late 1880s. They had concessions. Well, you can imagine what a concession was back then. It began to explode, and pretty soon the Japanese army came in, and they occupied Korea. It wasn't separated then by any parallel or truce lines. It was a country, and it was administered horribly by the Japanese. The Japanese required the Korean people to name their children in Japanese names, to speak the Japanese language. Their men were drafted into the Japanese army. And tragically, their women were put into comfort battalions, which has been a burr under the saddle of the Korean nation ever since. Comfort battalions, I can let your imagination go as to what you thought those were. And these battalions of women were taken into the South Pacific to service Japanese soldiers. Japanese have never apologized for that. And this country, being occupied by the Japanese, was a threat to the war effort. During World War II, the American propaganda machine let loose the word that the American government was going to raid or release the Japanese-held land in China, along the coast of China. Actually, they were going to invade China. Well, the Japanese were astonished at this. They couldn't let that happen. So they brought an awful lot of Japanese soldiers, first-line soldiers, to Korea, 300,000 of them. and they stationed them in Korea to offset this alleged invasion. It never happened, but it did accomplish something. It kept those 300,000 soldiers in Korea, and they weren't fighting the nations that were against Japan in the Pacific. So when the war was over, in fact, here a little thing is the Russians came into the war about 3 days before the war ended, and they took one of the North Islands of Japan. And since they were part of the Allied forces, they were tasked with disarming the Japanese soldiers in the northern part of Korea. And the Americans were tasked with doing the same thing in the South. Well, we did as they asked us to do and destroyed the weapons and sent the soldiers home. The Russians didn't do that. They formed a multi-million man army, and they used the Japanese weapons to arm those army. There's a man, his name was Kim Il-sung, and he had been a colonel in the Russian army during World War II. He was very brave. And Premier Stalin promoted him and sent him back to Korea after the war as an advisor. Well, when the Koreans disarmed the Japanese soldiers, he was right there, and he helped form this million-man army. And he rose up through the command to be the leader of their country. And it was he who planned to unify Korea. Now there's another premier in the South, and he wanted to unify Korea, but he wanted to do it peacefully. Although if he had the wherewithal, he would have done it. But the Americans didn't give him the tanks and the ammunition and the hardware to overthrow the North. So it was a peaceful South Korea. 5 years after the end of World War II, the Russians advisors left North Korea, and Kim Il-sung was on his own, and he unleashed his million-man army across the parallel which divided those two countries. Well, of course, the South wasn't ready for that, and they were overrun. General MacArthur, who had been in Japan, bringing democracy to Japan, which he did a pretty good job of, his people were not prepared. And they were like a steamroller, the North Koreans. And they moved all the way down through South Korea. But at this point, their supply lines were quite extended. And it took them a while to try to wipe out the South Korean army. The premier of South Korea asked for some help through the United Nations. And through a fluke, and it was really a fluke because the Americans went to the United Nations and asked the United Nations to help. Had the Russians been there that day, they would have vetoed that. But they were arrogant people, and because they had been rebuked by us, we didn't want to allow Red China into the United Nations, they boycotted that day. So the request for help from South Korea went through, and President Truman organized our reserves and sent help to South Korea. This was in the form of a brigade, which is, in military terms, a little bit more than a regiment, but it had all the supporting arms of an army, a small army. And they sent them immediately, within a matter of weeks after the war, in June. In fact, the regiment left, the brigade left in July, right about a month after the war started, which was phenomenal. And it helped hold the fort, so to speak, at an area called Pusan in the south part of Korea. As I said, the North Korean forces had been weakened by that point. And this gave us enough time back in the United States to form divisions, large groups of Marines and soldiers to go to Korea's help. And this is what happened from there on out for the next 2 years. These replacement drafts I spoke of in the beginning started pouring into Korea, and they started pushing back the North Koreans. And they were able to push them all the way back, just about up to the end of the beginning of North Korea in the Yalu River. But there's a big but here. The North Koreans had an ally, and that ally was China. China didn't really want to get involved in a land warfare with the United Nations. However, they told the premier of North Korea that they'd help him if the American troops came over the 38th parallel chasing the North Korean army. Well, General MacArthur was advised by the premier of China not to do this, and he ignored that. In fact, the wording was then, MacArthur said, "I have atomic bombs." And the premier of China said, "I have millions of men, I'm not worried." So the bombs, of course, were not used, and MacArthur led his troops up to the Yalu, which waiting for us up there were over 300,000 Chinese. These were Chinese volunteers, and they came from all over China. And most of them had never seen snow, and this was the beginning of the winter of 1951. And they came across the Yalu and pushed the United Nations forces back out of North Korea. And this was the beginning of what I had spoken about earlier in this interview of trench warfare. It was a seesaw battle back and forth to where it finally centered around the 38th parallel. And this parallel was a zigzag line across the width of Korea, which is there today. And the line was a line of trenches, very deep on both sides, opposing trenches. The Chinese had the exact same thing we had. They were called MLRs, main line of resistance, and they were interlocking trenches the width of Korea. 2 or 3 miles above to the north of our lines, the Chinese had the same thing. So it was a seesaw battle back and forth. Attrition of lives, a lot of people being killed. And in between these MLRs, there were something called OPLRs, outposts. And these outposts were nothing but warning areas to tell the main line if the other enemy was advancing onto their line. And through this OP, a lot of the fighting was done for more land. In 1953, peace talks began.
But I want to know more about what you actually saw when you first got there. What did you see? What was your impression of Korea?
Well, as I say, we landed at a place called Sokol-ri, and we boarded trucks. And being in the back of a covered truck, taking mile after mile, beginning, it was a very dusty road, so we didn't see much of the villages. But we were, and speaking of villages, there really were none. I was in North Korea, and I don't think in the whole time I was there, during that first time I was in Korea, the first 13 months, I ever saw a Korean. Because the villages had all been evacuated. This was North Korea, and a lot of war had happened in their area. The seesaw war I spoke about earlier. So as we proceeded up the mountain trails to where our battalion was, it began to get into the winter, and most of the area was snowbound back in that area. The temperatures had dropped down into 10, 20 below zero. The roads were nothing but ice, very precipitous, very difficult to drive on. One of my jobs was driving trucks to supply men and equipment up into the area I spoke about earlier called the Punch Bowl. This is where the infantry units were fighting the Chinese before they went into the static war of trench warfare. And this was horrible fighting on the mountains of southeast North Korea. The temperatures, as I said, were horrendous. It was very difficult to keep from frostbite. We were getting pretty good cold weather gear, but still being out in the weather to this degree, our weapons would sometime malfunction because of the grease and oil that was on them would freeze. The artillery people had a difficult time with this. As we went up into the mountains of southeast North Korea, we would climb these mountains, and all of a sudden we would see large searchlights. I thought this was very strange. Searchlights? What they did with these searchlights was use them to beam off the low clouds, and at night it would be like daylight. And it was awesome to see this, and to see soldiers. You could see them in this light. We brought up supplies and equipment to the men that were in these mountains during this particular time. And that was mostly my job during that first tour in Korea. While we were there, the threat was brought forth of an invasion on the left side of Korea, or the west part of Korea near Seoul. Seoul was becoming threatened. The Marine Division, which I was part of at that time, was moved from the southeast corner of North Korea to an area north of Seoul called Kaesong, or Panmunjom. This was where the peace talks were beginning to take place. Now, this was in 1952 and the beginning of 1953. The threat was that the North was going to reinvade the South again. So the Marine Division, which I was part of, was brought over to this area, and we were put into what were called blocking positions to prevent the Chinese from coming down and retaking Seoul. The Chinese were doing the same thing on the north of Panmunjom, so it was a very hostile area. The OPLRs that I talked about earlier, were in constant turmoil. A lot of fighting going on. My one experience in one of them was a place called The Hook. This was a outcropping of land in between the two main lines that resembled a portion of a hook. And it was occupied by, well, at various times, a squad of Marines to a company of Marines, depending on the threat. My unit had been reinforcing that area with timber, and we could only move at night, and the trucks would move at night without any lights to move up to the outpost because we were within view of the Chinese artillery, and if they could see us, they would fire at us. So we had to do everything during the night. If we were there and this incident did happen, we were caught there at daylight, so we had to stay. And the outpost was attacked while we were there. The Chinese could see what was going on, and they saw the reinforcements, so they attacked. We took the ammunition and guns off of our trucks, and the infantry units interplaced us within their units, and we helped repel the Chinese that were attacking that particular outpost. Casualties were taken by both sides. Nothing was gained. In fact, nothing ever was gained except yards or maybe a mile of ground, and lives were lost. As it darkened that night, we were able to leave the outpost and take our equipment that we needed to and our trucks back to the main line. But this went on constantly on the OPs that protected the area of the main line. The reasoning for this was the peace talks were being taken seriously by this time. The North would come into Panmunjom to a table that was split in the middle, and the South with the United Nations would come into the South part, and they would exchange barbs between them and argue and fight verbally on what was going to happen when the ceasefire finally came in. I was there when this happened, and the silence was deafening, because at one point we stopped firing, and the Chinese stopped also. And this was beginning of the truce. Well, ceasefire, we never really gained anything, because they still do that same thing today. The parallel is still there. The demilitarized zone is still there. The North is still shelling the South. They caused 80-some casualties in a South Korean ship last year. And they rattle their saber all the time. Mm-hmm. We never know what's going to happen. I can't imagine living near the DMZ in South Korea under the aspects of what those people live under, knowing that multi-million-man army is sitting there waiting. I guess the biggest hardship that I personally faced was dealing with the cold. It was horrible. I still have an aversion to an open refrigerator door, and even though it's been so many years back. But we eventually were given good cold weather gear, but in the beginning we didn't have this. And many men suffered from frostbite. I still have those memories of that today. We were adequately fed and housed, and we had mostly heated areas that we could live in. But the cold was atrocious. And I did 2 tours in Korea. My second tour was just as the peace talks started. So the ceasefire happened right after I got there on my second tour. So I didn't experience anything bad then. The living was relatively acceptable, so to speak. Although there were times that the North Koreans fired, as we know, into the South Korean area. That was probably my most thing that I bring away from Korea was the cold, the numbing cold. And today, even when I go anywhere when it's cold, it brings back memories of those days. And even though we were adequately equipped at times, I can still remember the cold.
Then on the other hand, did you have any happy memories, most rewarding memory while you were in Korea?
I remember, yes, it was many happy memories. I remember when we were moving from one coast of Korea to the other, I began to see Korean villages and people. And sometime we would stop for whatever it was, and the people would come out, and we didn't speak the same language, but we could see that they appreciated what we were doing. And I remember a little girl came up to me, and she was in her Korean clothes, and I had a picture of I wasn't married then. I had a picture of my niece, and my niece was about the same age as this little girl, about 5 years old. So I took the picture out and showed it to her. And she made such a to-do over the picture, and I couldn't understand why. And she kept pointing to the picture. And my niece was just in a little uniform with a flower in her hair. So we had an interpreter, and I went and got him, and I said, "Why is she so excited over this picture?" And he said, "She can't understand why she has a flower in her hair."
Oh. Did you have interactions and relationships with the Korean soldiers too? Like the interpreter, you had him there?
We had interpreters, one or two with us at times, and we were allowed indigenous people to work for us sometime. And I'm not too sure where they came from, but we had 2 or 3 people that did manual labor around our area that helped start the fires, do things, menial things that they did. And they were paid, I don't know how much, but it wasn't very much. And I didn't get to know them very well. In later years, in my second time there was a little boy that was adopted by the battalion. And they sent, most of the Marines went back to their families through the mail and had clothes sent out for him. His name was an American named Jimmy. And he was quite a nice little guy. And he was adopted by one of the Marines. And in later years, I found out that he came back to the United States with the Marine and became a lawyer. Wow,
really? That's
which
amazing.
Was nice.
Yeah.
That was a nice memory.
Oh, that is.
I didn't interact too much with the Korean people because we didn't see them very much. The trip from one coast to another, it was when I saw the first villages. And we went through Seoul, which was devastated. I don't remember anybody in Seoul. The buildings were all crumbled and had been just blown up. And then we went north. I'm not too sure where the 38th parallel was then, but again we got to an area where our battalion went to, and there were no villages there. But we did have the interpreter with us, and that's the only Korean I know, and I can't remember his name now or where he was from. But we had different interpreters at times. I had very little contact with the Korean people. I remember the interpreter brought me some Korean food, and he called it kimchi, and it was very hot. And I'm not too much for spicy foods, but it was good. It was good. I liked it.
Oh, did you suffer from any wounds?
No. I was very lucky. Frostbite is the only thing that I had, and I got over that very quickly. My fingers and my toes, and our corpsman took care of that. It went away and has not bothered me, but luckily, no. Concussion, which was the Chinese used grenades that were not very good, and most of them didn't go off, and they were black powder grenades, and when they'd throw them at us, they would cause a concussion, which was not like ours. Ours were metal and had shrapnel in them. These were what they called stick grenades, and the end of it was like a rice paper with black powder in it, and it caused concussion. Most of them didn't go off. They were very ineffective. And I had some concussion, but nothing that would ever debilitate me.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Can you tell me again the bigger timeline of, you said 2 tours. So when did you then go enter second time, and then when did you come out of Korea?
The second time I went into Korea was about, I think it was March of 1953. What had happened, and I would like to explain this, I came back from my first tour in Korea in December of 52. I went over in November of 51. So this was December of 52. I came back to the United States. And at that time, the west coast of the United States was very knowledgeable of Korea because the soldiers and Marines and sailors had been coming back for a number of months out of this combat zone. And everyone there knew about the war in Korea. In fact, San Francisco was very much a military town at that time. If you were in uniform, you could hardly buy a meal. People would buy meals for you or drinks or whatever. And most of us spent 2 or 3 days in San Francisco waiting for orders to go wherever we were stationed. Well, most of us went on leave. And since we had been away for a year, we had usually 30 to more days leave. So I went back east, and as I got further back east, the more I went, the less people knew about the war in Korea. Until I finally got back to Pennsylvania, where I originally started from, very little was known. Now you have to understand the lack of communication in the United States back then. For example, if you were in San Francisco and you wished to dial, to contact by phone New York, you went to a rotary phone and dialed 0 and asked for the long distance operator, who came online, took your number, and would call you back sometime. So the communication between our big country, 3,000 miles, was nil. Very little people on the East Coast knew much about it except those who had been affected by the people that had been wounded or killed in action. And this bothered me a lot. And because I had just come out of a combat situation, and here people, my friends that I knew nothing about it. They want to know where the hell I had been. I haven't seen you in a while. And I had been in some drastic situations. So this bothered me. I didn't want to be around them. So I raised my hand and said, I'll go back. And they were looking, and the Marine Corps was looking, the military was looking for volunteers. So I was only here for a couple months until I joined another replacement draft and went back to Korea. And this time I got there while the peace talks were going on. This was, I believe, March of 1953. And the peace talks were solidified again in June, and the ceasefire happened in June. And I stayed there in this battalion I was in. I went back to the same battalion I had been in before, a different letter company, but the same battalion. And I stayed there because we were going to leave. Each month we were told we were going to leave, and it didn't happen. I stayed there for 2 years. And after the 2 years, the whole division, which was over 20,000 men, were brought back to the United States. And I came back to San Francisco again welcomed by the people of San Francisco, and went through the same routine as I did earlier, being welcomed by the people of San Francisco. But by this time, most people in the United States have been aware of the war, the tragic war in Korea. And we were at peace for a while anyway.
What month was it? So it was 1955 when you returned?
1955. Again, this was March of 1955.
What was the impact of the war and your time in Korea upon your life, do you think?
Very effective, because I was 21 years old. And I often thought of my brother who had been killed when he was 21 in combat. So this was terrifying to me, to be shot at. And this happened a few times. And I survived this. And it made me much aware of what I could do and my capabilities in life. I wasn't too sure of this before that, because in the time before Korea, I was a little wandering. I wasn't too sure what I was going to do with life until Korea came along. And then, as I said earlier, I wasn't allowed to go. And this bothered me. So when I was allowed to go and experienced combat, I think it made a young man out of me and gave me some goals in life. So that when I came back, I started bettering myself a little bit better, trying to do things for myself. I knew that I had to, we had what was called a bootstrap program, and the Marine Corps encouraged Marines to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. In other words, take education courses, do things. So I wanted to go to college, but I was in the service, so I took college degree courses and prepared myself for this. We had what was called a general classification test back then. I took that over again from my original recruitment test and enhanced that. So I think I became a better person. And of course, in that time, I was only back here about 6 months when I met the love of my life. And we married 6 months after that. And we've been married 59 years. So I think I was prepared to meet my wife, to settle down and become a help to this country.
Mm-hmm. What kind of a career did you have after the war?
Well, I stayed in the Marine Corps. And I was stationed in Washington, D.C. And I worked in the White House. I was security for President Roosevelt. And we had a place called Camp David up in the Catoctin Mountains. I was security for him there. And then I became a drill instructor. This is an instructor of young Marine recruits at Parris Island in South Carolina. And at this time, my wife joined me there, and we had our first child, first and only child. I shouldn't say it that way. We had our only child, our daughter, who lives here in San Diego. And we stayed there for 3 years in South Carolina, came out to the West Coast, and were stationed in San Diego for a while. And then I received orders to South Vietnam. Actually, I didn't go into South Vietnam first. I went into Thailand as an advisor. And while I was there, a strange thing happened in the Marine Corps back in those years. We had what was called a draft. And any young man from 18 to 25 was required to register for the draft. And if he was selected by his draft board, he was required to serve. Well, if you were deferred, you didn't have to serve. And there were many reasons why men back then were deferred. They could be the sole supporter of their family. They could be a farmer. They could be a college student. They could be anything. They could be married, and they were deferred. Now, a lot of men went to college, so they were deferred from going to Vietnam. The Vietnam War was not a happy war. People were not happy with it. They didn't think we should be there. So a lot of young men didn't want to go to Vietnam. So the college graduates, when they graduated, usually they would go into the Marine Corps. Well, if they got married, they didn't have to go into the service. I wonder how many got married back in the 50s that really didn't want to get married. But some of them didn't want to get married either, and they asked for asylum in Canada. So these people left the United States. So we didn't have the young men coming into the Marine Corps or the Army as young officers. So the Marine Corps, having expanded tremendously in Vietnam, looked down to their senior non-commissioned officers, which I was one, and commissioned me immediately as a lieutenant. And I became a platoon commander in Vietnam. And I finished my tour in Vietnam. Again, it was a 13-month tour. I was in a combat zone in the northern part of Vietnam, and I had a very large platoon and successfully brought most of the men back without any problems. Came back again to San Diego here, and this was time about for me to retire. I had 25 years in the Marine Corps at that time, and I was a captain, so I retired as a captain from the Marines. I entered civilian life, and I had to learn 2 new words that started with the letter C. One was condominium. I had no idea what a condominium was. We didn't have those in the service, and it was a new term in civilian life. And the second term was computer. What is a computer? Well, this was 1971. So I went to one of the colleges and I learned Fortran and COBOL, which are the beginnings of the languages of computers. And I got into the bottom level of computerism. And I began to figure out that I could do things a little bit better with computers than people were doing with the old ledgers that they used. So I got into accounting. And I was able to do accounting for people that had been filling out ledgers by red and green ink and black ink, whatever they had. And I could do this if I was given the information from these clients that I solicited. So I began to solicit from people that I could do their accounting better. I knew nothing about accounting, but I figured computers could do it for me. And I began to learn. So I formed a small accounting firm. And I headed toward a certain type of clientele. And these were new car dealerships. Because they were atrocious for their accounting, it was very bad. And they weren't making very much money back in those years. So my firm was able to go in and help them with their accounting. And I had this firm for 25 years. And it was very successful. I retired from it again after the 25 years. And at this time, I was able to devote my time back to the Marine Corps, kind of like a payback. And I'm now a docent. And I teach at the Marine Corps Museum at Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego and at the Marine Corps Air Station at Miramar. And I love what I do. And being 84 years old, it's wonderful for me to be able to react to the young Marines that come under my purview each week. And each week we have about 500 young men that we take through the museum, teach them about Marine Corps history, and I love my job.
Have you been back to Korea just to visit?
No, I haven't, but I've been offered many times a chance to go back. It hasn't happened. I'd like to think it might happen. I've heard about the how's the word, the generosity of the Korean people toward the Korean veterans. It's fantastic. They're very generous to them and gracious for the fact of what they've done. And they acknowledge the fact that we went there because our country asked us to help. And the Korean people asked for help, and that's what we did. And it's a payback time for them too. And I've heard nothing but good word from the men that have gone back, men and women that have gone back and tasted the new Korean culture. I'm so proud of Korea. It's such a beautiful country, democratic. Of course, they have their problems like we have, but every country has that. And they stand up and they're counted. And I'm glad that I can say that I helped them get to where they are today.
Do you think the young people should know about it, learn about it?
I'm glad you touched on that, because one of the other things I do as a docent, there's several of us that go out to the local high schools upon their request. The history teachers, she asks us to come every year to her history class. And we go, Korean veterans, and we go to the school, and for a whole day we sit in the classroom. And the students change every 45 minutes. And we talk to them about the Korean War. What was it like? What did we do? Where did we go? How did we live? What did we eat? What were things that we did? And they have all kinds of questions, and they're pretty attentive. Oh, one or two might go to sleep, but they're seniors, and if we get them right early in the morning, they're great. But right after lunch, they tend to go to sleep. But it's wonderful for us that we can do that, and she invites us back every year.
The two divided South and North were to reunite, or if there was a petition, do you support the reunification of Korea? Would you sign that petition?
I've thought about that question, and I'd have to know a lot more about what the country would be like. There's all possibilities. Would it be communist? Would it be democratic? Would it be a coalition? Mostly they don't work. But I'd have to know whether I would ever support that. And I think there would be a lot of questions among those of us that were involved in that country. Because we have something at stake. Even though we're old now, at one time we had a lot at stake. And I'd like to know more about it. I'd like to see the country united, of course. The specter of Vietnam haunts me because the country is communist, but nothing happened. The North ignored the South, and it's thrown into disuse. What would happen? They're so divergent. They're so different now. But when the country was split, the 38th parallel was not very fair because all the big industry was in the north. The hydroelectric dams, everything was in the north. And look what the South has done in all these years since. What a wonderful, beautiful country. Not so for the North. We've seen the reunification of Germany, and it seems to have worked out. But it's been a tremendous amount of money to rescue the communist-led East Germany. Would that happen here? And would we rescue North Korea? I don't know. So to answer your question, I don't know whether I would support that or not. I'd have to know a lot about how it would come about. I'd love to see it happen under my terms, but I don't know if everybody's terms would be my terms.